Hello, I'm Cy Goodman. I'm Regents Professor here at Georgia Tech, and I am pleased to welcome you all to our final session for our symposium on the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War in Europe. And we are going to be concerned in this final session with the deployment of technology during this period. And we will have two speakers in addition to myself. Both of whom you've seen before in previous sessions. One will be John Morrow, the Franklin Professor at the University of Georgia, and General Phil Breedlove, former SACEUR, who is a distinguished professor of the practice here at Georgia Tech. As was the case for our first two sessions, please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A functions. When we finish our presentations, we will open this up with the questions and answers, hopefully some answers. And Chris McDermott will moderate that session and select questions to pose to all of us. We'll be joined in that period by Woody Woodcock, who you saw on the first day of this symposium. Chris, put me up. So here we are. And this is the order we're going to go in. For further information, if you're interested in presenters and Woody, you can refer to the playbill that was circulated for all of you. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about deploy technologies, and I think it'll be useful, particularly given some of the things that all of us have to say, to define technologies and to give an effective definition of deployment. Technology actually is something that most people don't have a good definition of. I've asked my students here at Tech and elsewhere over many, many years to define technology. I get all kinds of answers that usually don't hold up very well. But the definition that I use, and I think is particularly suitable for our session today, is technology is essentially know-how. And it's know-how to conceive of, design, develop, produce, distribute, maintain useful products and processes. And I emphasize processes in this. And the term is often used for the products and the processes themselves. But the emphasis to be made in our definition here is know-how and to include processes, not just products. As much of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be in the form of processes. Now, what constitutes deployment? Well, getting working products and processes up in sufficient quantity and sufficient focus to have a perceptible influence on, in our case, military operations. But we're a bit more general than just military operations here because we're covering the beginning of the Cold War period, and there are other aspects than straight military to that. But technology will be important for those processes as well. Next slide, please. So, most of you are familiar with all kinds of technologies that were made famous over the course and after World War II. And most of the technologies that do emerge and are effectively deployed by both the Allied and the Axis powers during this war, these were largely done by 1943. They were up and running. I'll go through very briefly. You can read that slide. I won't belabor the list there. But the war was very much in progress by 1944. And all of the combatants had very large armies that were well equipped, some more than others, in all of the ways that are described below. Radar in multiple forms, and I put, as I do with some of the others, the countries that were really the leaders in these areas. It cannot be understated, particularly for the U.S. and Great Britain, how important radar was for our conduct of the war. The 4-engine heavy bombers, other countries had them, but in terms of effective deployment, only the U.S. and Great Britain really mastered, if you like, the technology and the processes associated with long-range heavy bomber, strategic bombing. Anti-submarine warfare technologies, the U.S. and Great Britain came up with a huge range of products and processes that essentially won the Battle of the Atlantic by the middle of 1943. Aircraft carriers, of course, they came into their own in World War II, although the first aircraft carrier actually dates back to 1918. And there are all sorts of other forms of naval aviation. For the European side of this, most of that was associated with the Battle of the Atlantic. But when we do our Asia Pacific Symposium next year, Japan, of course, as you all know, was very prominent in developing aircraft carriers and naval aviation. One of the great processes that was mastered, particularly by the U.S. and the Soviet Union, less so for Germany than most people think, was the massive production and deployment of land vehicles, tanks, trucks, whatever. Landing craft is fairly unique to the United States, but by the time we got to Normandy, we had all kinds of landing craft in very large numbers, very effectively deployed. Cryptography and related to cryptography, but other things as well, analog computers were really quite well established by 1944. And most of these technologies were upgraded during the last year and a half of the war, but they were effectively deployed. So we won't consider them further in the course of the remainder of this session. Next slide, please. So what will we consider? Well, I'll consider essentially a fair number of technologies that emerged and were effectively deployed from roughly mid-1944 onward, with the notable exception, which John and Phil will pick up on, with things that fly. It turns out for most of the period they were interested in, and especially after the end of the war, things that fly are far more important and numerous than virtually. But during the course of the end of the war, we had a number of technologies that were first deployed, and effectively so, with Operation Overlord, which includes D-Day, but it includes a whole bunch of things leading up to D-Day and a whole bunch of things to basically get ourselves beyond Normandy in France. The first of these technologies is a set of, if you like, devices that were attached to usually British Churchill or American Sherman tanks called Percy Hobart's Funnies. And Percy Hobart was a major general, British Army, brigade commander, I guess, for a good part of that. And he came up with all of these devices, some of which were rather peculiar to the idea of the Normandy landing. And I'll show you some of these, but basically they put bridges and flamethrowers and snorkels and floats and what have you on all these tanks to expedite what they were supposed to do, flailing chains on the front to clear mines and what have you. I'll show you a couple of these, but they actually made these tanks more effective than they would otherwise have been, particularly for those landings. The most significant, if you like, of the deployed technologies, really novel technologies that were associated with Overlord, were the Mulberry artificial harbors. Again, this is basically a logistics issue. We talked about this session on Monday. But so you land a big army on these beaches in Normandy, and then what? Okay, how do you get beyond the initial foothold? And ideally, if you're going to try to do something like that, you want to land close and you want to seize a harbor so that you can bring a whole lot of stuff, people and vehicles and ammunition and what have you, across that English Channel and unload them so that you can keep supplying the folks who have already landed and support the others that are coming in so you can get well beyond that foothold. Well, Normandy's 5 beaches had nothing approaching harbor quality. And the nearest harbors, places like Cherbourg, were extremely well defended. The plan was, as part of the breakout, to seize these harbors. But the Germans weren't going to cooperate. They weren't going to give them up easily, and they were going to make a mess of them before the Allies could get there. And so the Allies, as part of the planning and the execution of Overlord, came up with these ideas, and mostly the British actually, with these mulberry artificial harbors. Picture of some of them. And essentially what was to be done was to come up with breakwaters to protect the beaches from the choppy water and weather and what have you. Basically put up barriers so that the waters beyond the barriers and the beaches were relatively calm. And then to set up artificial piers. This is no small thing from a civil and mechanical engineering perspective. To set up piers that are deep enough in the water so that large ships could come by and unload on these piers, and then set up roadways from some miles out from these piers to the beaches. And so the ships could be unloaded onto the trucks, many of which are the 2.5-ton trucks that I described on Monday's session, and basically drive onto the beaches and beyond the beaches to supply the troops that are there. As a civil and mechanical engineering project, the mulberries in particular were just mind-boggling. I'll show you a little bit of pictures. I mean, the scale of these things were incredible. Coming up with the designs for harbors that were just sort of planted in the middle of the water and could go, could be unloaded in rough waters. The roads that were going from the piers to the beaches were sort of a chain of various kinds of short pontoon-like kinds of bridges that had to the connectivity, the actual design of these things, so they could hold up while the water underneath them was doing whatever it does, not to mention some weather problems, was a truly remarkable achievement for the mechanical and civil engineers there. I'll give you a sense of the scale of that. I won't dwell on this too much, but I can't say enough about how important these artificial harbors were. The initial landings were essentially supported by landing craft that could unload troops and a small number of vehicles, with the exception of the very important LSTs, which were very well established at a large landing craft, and they could unload disgorge a good amount of vehicles in particular, but still not enough, as much as could be carried by a ship and unloaded on a pier. The last of the technologies associated with Overlord bring up is Pluto, a pipeline under the ocean. Among the things that have to be brought ashore for a large invading army and to make it possible for that army to get out of its foothold, or get out of its toehold and beyond its foothold, to use Woody's terms from Monday, and really out into France and go after Germany, you have tens of thousands, really ultimately hundreds of thousands of vehicles of all kinds, and you've got to supply them with fuel. And it's no small thing to bring in the kind of fuel, the thousands and thousands of gallons per day that were necessary to do this. And the Allies came up with, again, the British were really quite prominent in this, with putting a pipeline under the English Channel, having it come up on the beaches, and eventually extending it over the course of the remainder of the war in the West so that a great deal of fuel could be supplied to the Allied land vehicles. And once we started putting airfields on the continent, we had to worry about aviation gasoline as well. Next slide, please. So there's an overview of one of the two Mulberry harbors. Okay, this is which is at Gold Beach for the British. We had one at Omaha Beach as well. That was called Mulberry A. Both of these harbors were in operation and doing tremendous work within a couple of weeks of the landings. Okay, actually less than a couple of weeks of the landing. But on June 19th, along came a storm that destroyed the Mulberry Harbor at Omaha Beach, and it beat up the harbor that you're seeing here at Arromanches. The Arromanches harbor had to be repaired. It was repaired fairly quickly, and it became the main source of supplying the Overlord campaign for really some time. What you see in front of you are closest to you is a bunch of parked ships that are within the breakwater. And then you see a line with sort of roads going into the harbor. The lines that the roads emanate from are the piers. And the roads going in are essentially these linked trestles that trucks basically went in and out of for a long time, and they just supplied. I mean, they did so much to make it possible to deal with the enormous logistical problems that we had after the landings at Normandy. Next slide, please. Just moving along, here are a couple of Hobart's funnies. These are British Churchill tanks. You can imagine that they can be useful here. The one to the left is carrying a portable bridge. It's no small thing, actually, to take heavy vehicles, trucks, tanks, what have you, across thick terrain that is not roads. Even tanks have some problems. And a bridge like that comes in real useful. The tank to the right has a snorkel on it, and I believe also had a flamethrower on it. And they proved rather useful here and ultimately in the Pacific for doing things like dealing with bunkers. Next slide, please. Here is a Sherman with a flailer on the front. Another one of Hobart's funnies. Basically, those chains are rotated. You can just imagine them spinning around. And they are lowered a bit, and they basically chop up the ground in front, and they diffuse all the mines that are in front of that tank. The Germans actually put millions of mines out to defend their various beaches and the Atlantic Wall, and this is probably one of the most effective of the Hobart's funnies, and I think was extremely well appreciated by all of the men who managed to follow those paths in. Next slide, please. So the other two, if you like, categories of technology that we're going to be talking about are computing and aviation. And 1944 actually is the birth of modern electronic digital computers. There are all sorts of calculating devices. People in computer science like to look back to extend their history as far as they can and go back to Babbage in the 1830s. But the real modern electronic digital computing era started in 1944. And 3 countries over the period that we are looking at, from 44 to 1950, were rather prominent in building these machines. And these are electronic, and the primary component are vacuum tubes. And they're digital as opposed to analog, and that's an important distinction that, of course, the digital versus analog has carried through to today and has virtually defined our societies in so many ways. And the first of these computers that were general purpose in the sense that they were programmable and electronic and digital came out of the British Bletchley Park Cryptological Center. And there was a fellow by the name of Tony Flowers who built 2 machines, the first of which, the Colossus Mark I, actually became operational in January of 1944. And these machines were basically used in a whole lot of the cryptological work being done at Bletchley Park. There was a Mark II, and these were the first 2 operational electronic digital computers that could be programmed, okay, not with stored memory, but by using toggle switches. I'll have a picture of how that's done in just a little bit. But the world did not appreciate that these were the first 2 electronic digital computers, because the British kept everything that happened at Bletchley Park so secret that it wasn't until the 1970s that the world appreciated that what the incredible groundbreaking technological deployments that occurred there with regard to computing. What most people thought of as the first electronic digital computer was the ENIAC, which is made in the United States. Professor Eckert and John Mauchly are associated with that. It was a joint effort, actually, with the engineering school at the University of Pennsylvania and the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. And the purpose was actually to put together firing tables for over-the-horizon kind of artillery needs. And much of the work before that actually was done by women shooting artillery and seeing where the things went with different wind conditions and what have you. But all of that can be handled computationally, and that was the purpose of the ENIAC. The ENIAC was not finished until actually the very end of 1945, so it actually had no role in the war. But it was used for some time afterwards, and it was considered the first electronic digital computer, but it turns out to be the first U.S. electronic digital computer. The EDSAC is a British machine, and it is the first stored program electronic digital computer. All of these things are what all of our computers are today, right? But they all got started during this period. And the EDSAC, the group that put that together was led by Maurice Wilkes at the University of Cambridge. And the British more generally actually were every bit as much of a leader in early electronic digital computing, and perhaps more so than the U.S. was for roughly the first decade of the modern computing era. The MESM is a Soviet machine. It's the first Soviet machine. It was completed and operational roughly by 1950. And the lead on that was Sergei Alexeyevich Lebedev. And the interesting thing about the MESM was that it was built at all, actually, successfully. He was given, he and his team, a rather remarkable group of Soviet scientists who succeeded against unbelievable odds. The odds against them started out with the facility they were given was an abandoned church outside of Kiev. There was no paved road, there was no electricity, there was no anything. A place like that, and the people who were associated with it must have suffered terribly during what Stalin did in the 1930s to Ukraine. Not to mention what happened when the Germans came through Kiev going east, and when the Soviets came through Kiev again going west. But this is what Medvedev was given, and he had a number of people, and he had to somehow, and it wasn't even, I mean, they didn't have vehicles to get out of there. The roads weren't, there just weren't roads, and no electricity. He had to deal with Soviet manufactured vacuum tubes. Nevertheless, this guy, who was probably the most underappreciated real pioneer of early computing, this guy put together a working machine by 1950, and it became the first of a long series of machines that Lebedev and his institutes eventually produced. I put the Univac down there because it doesn't fit in our dates. It actually is 1951. There were a whole bunch of other computers that didn't amount to much, but these really amounted to a great deal. The Univac was actually an outgrowth of the ENIAC team, and it was the first serially produced electronic digital computer with stored programs of any real great consequence. It is most noted, the first one was actually for the Census Bureau. The fifth one was for the Atomic Energy Commission, and it was used by CBS in 1952 to predict the election results, which it did on the basis of a 1% return of the votes for the presidential election. And it became famous for that. And that's actually the machine and the event that brought computing into the minds of most Americans. At this point, we're going to turn to John and to Phil. I will point out that various things that most of you will think of that you associate with World War II from a technology standpoint, a lot of medical developments, the atomic bomb, the B-29 and others, we're saving those for our Asia-Pacific version of this symposium. And with that, John, you're on.
Thanks very much, Cy. It's a pleasure to be with you folks again. I have the honor of doing the U.S. Air Force in the transitional era. And I should also explain immediately that I will be followed by General Breedlove, and they were going to ask Colonel Woodcock to return. Both of these gentlemen were F-16 pilots in their younger days. And so if I should raise any questions about MiGs and Sabres at the beginning, I'm just going to drop them in their laps because Phil has the period that will deal with all that. But I think I should let you know we've got some very knowledgeable folks on this panel. I'm going to start with some general statistics because I think we need to know just how significant the U.S. Army Air Forces had become in the Second World War. At the peak, the U.S. Army Air Forces had 2.5 million men and women in their ranks, and 80,000 airplanes, of which 43,000 were combat planes. And it flew from nearly 800 bases domestically and 1,600 airfields around the globe. These are indisputably the most powerful air forces in the world at that time. But it's worth it to note that it was not, the Air Force, I repeat, was not separate from or equal to the Army. It developed from the Army Air Corps to the Army Air Force. But at the same time, by the end of the war, headquarters Army Air Forces controlled all aspects of the global air war and air policy. It had achieved autonomy from the Army. It was virtually independent of the Army, but not separate and equal yet. Now, George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff, who was the commanding general of the Army Air Forces, between themselves, not only on the autonomy of the Air Forces, but also on the independence of the Air Forces after the war, although they were receiving opposition from the General Staff and the U.S. Navy as well. Unofficially off the record, Marshall treated Arnold as his equal. But as you can see, there is a point there that the Air Forces are not officially independent. I'd like to also take a look at the wartime tally before we continue. I'll do the planes at the end because they give you a sense of sacrifice the Air Forces. Talk about bombs dropped, missions, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the losses, this is when you see the real significance of the Air Force. Of the 88,000 airmen who died in service, 52,000 of them fell in combat. They were battle casualties. Total aircraft losses in the war were about 65,000, in combat 23,000. Now that lets you know, both of those tallies let you know that flying, period, was dangerous. It was dangerous in the First World War. It was dangerous in the Second. A number of crews, and I've met some airmen who flew B-24s at a certain time when the B-24s had a really bad reputation, even in training, of bursting into flames because the Davis wing juncture had fuel tanks there, and you never knew if you hit too hard whether they were going to go off into flames. 23,000 men killed in combat out of those, 23,000 airplanes lost in combat out of those 65,000. But I think there's one figure that highlights the significance, period. And that is the mighty 8th Air Force, Air Force that flew out of England over northwestern Europe, lost 26,000 men killed in combat. And you note that that's half of the casualties, the battle casualties of the Air Force. I would also note that those casualties are higher than the total casualties of the United States Marine Corps in World War II by 4,000 men. So the air war, if it appears people to be clamorous, etc., it may be, but those men are putting their life on the lines every time they go up and go into combat. Now, demobilization, when it strikes the post-war era, is drastic. The Air Force declined from 2.25 million men and women in August 1945 to a little over 300,000 in 1947. And by that time, there were 3 combat operational commands: the strategic, the tactical, and the air defense command. I'm not really going to talk much about military air transport, although you note that by the time of the Berlin blockade in 48, Phil will take that, we're flying 4-engine C-54 transports. President Truman supported an independent Air Force, and this is absolutely crucial because in the National Security Act of 1947, the U.S. Air Force became independent, and although there were things to be ironed out into the 50s, that was the situation that we're talking about. Now, what's fascinating about this era in terms of the aircraft is that this truly is the transitional era, piston to jet-powered planes. This doesn't mean that piston engines and piston engine aircraft disappeared from the scene in combat because those of you who follow aircraft, you know people we're still using piston engine aircrafts all the way through Vietnam. So it's not the end of the piston engine aircraft. But when you're thinking about air combat, the transition is going to have to occur from the piston engine aircraft to the jet aircraft. I think one of the most fascinating airplanes of the era, and I couldn't resist when Phil, Woody, and I got together the first time. I said, you know, fellas, I thought about entitling my presentation, Who Remembers the B-36? And all three of us went, yes, we all remember the B-36. Well, this is the perfect transitional aircraft of the time. The Convair B-36, and the Convair was a combination of Consolidated and Vultee aircraft companies. First flew in 1946 and went to the Air Force in 1948. And it was the only truly intercontinental bomber of the time. This thing is absolutely, I don't have any slides because usually if I get a hold of a slide, I lose myself in the slide. Are you okay? Hello?
John, go ahead.
Anything I can do?
John, we're hearing you fine. Your face freezes. You might just want to carry on. Chris, can you hear me? Chris, can you hear me?
Chris,
you
there?
lost Chris.
John, you're breaking up. Chris, can you hear us?
John seems to have gotten knocked off.
And I can't raise Chris. I mean, I could go ahead and start and then let John come back in afterwards.
We may have to do that. I have no idea what has happened to Chris.
I think I have his phone number. I'll call him.
No, I can do that.
Would you do that if you have his number and let him know we've... For those of you in the audience, I see a note saying you can hear me fine. If we don't get John on very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and start my part, and then we'll raise him. If you'll just give us about a half a minute to try to sort this out, we'll be back with you.
Sorry about that. What's the issue?
Oh,
John has fallen off. Nobody can see him. The audience are sending me a note saying they can see and hear me fine. If we can't bring John up very quickly, I can go ahead and start while you work John's problem.
Okay, sounds good. I don't know why he was dropped. You may want to go ahead and get started, and then I'll check on John.
Ty, give me a thumbs up if that's what you want me to do.
yeah, that'll be okay. Do we think we're going to get John real soon?
I don't know what the issue is.
The audience chat is saying they're hearing all of us fine, but they can't see Dr. Morrow.
Don't think John's on any.
So, gentlemen, if you want, I'll go ahead and get started. It'll be a little bit. Okay, thank you. So flexibility is the key to air power, isn't it? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I'm glad to be back, and I've enjoyed the last 2 days. I think I learned so much when I listened to real scholars. So today I've actually been given leeway to take a little different tack in looking at technology and how it shaped our Air Force post-World War II. Militaries have always identified themselves in terms of tribes, and frankly, it could be good and bad. In fact, the Air Force has been faulted across the last couple of decades. As much has been written about the rise of the fighter generals, when actually other portions of the Air Force have been growing into prominence. For some decades now, most chiefs of staff of the Air Force have been fighter pilots, and most vice chiefs of staff have been from the other tribes of the Air Force. Notably, Chief Schwartz and I were different. He was a special operator, and I, as the vice chief, was a fighter pilot. So these tribes can be both good and bad because it's about pride and sometimes about unhealthy competition. The Army, of course, having infantry, armor, cavalry, artillery, and aviation, and the differences in these tribes. The Navy, surface, subsurface, and what they called the Airedales. The Marines, different, celebrate that they're always a rifleman first, but then they grow into either grunts or Airedales or aviators. And so today what I'll do is look at technology and how that developed an Air Force culture. Again, while we will talk about tribes, often they are seen as derogatory, and how did they come about? So where did it all begin? I think an important set of numbers to remember John was covering, and that was the immense amount of loss of life in the air service during World War II. And you heard about how many more than even the Marines in the Pacific Airmen were lost. Some numbers. He talked about airmen, which of course is an important impact. Let me just throw a few other things out. 21,452 fighter aircraft were lost. 12,037 bombers were lost. Here's an incredible figure that's not talked about often. 15,428 trainers were lost. We killed an awful lot of airmen training airmen. And so the technology of how we train had not come into the fore. And then, as John said, often the untold story, we lost 6,141 transports. And I'll try to talk to that specifically in a few minutes. So how I want to do this is, rather than go chronologically, I want to talk about tribes because they began forming what our Air Force was as it began. And the first I would like to talk about is the age of the bomber. Across the last 2 days and the remarks that John just had, you have heard about the bombers and the bomber campaigns and how critical they were in both theaters of World War II, but certainly in the European theater. Yesterday, we heard a lot about the destruction. Some of it probably not appropriate and some of it effective, but how it affected all of the countries. A good discussion started just the other day in this fora about counter value and counter force. Counter value, of course, being seen as going after cities, people, and the will of the people, and counter force going after military capability. And our bomber campaigns and the evolution of bomber technology were all wrapped up in this decision-making process about where we going to conduct a counter force campaign, which we would normally rather do because it called for less destruction of non-combatants, but how we often ended up in a counter value fight because we did not have the technology to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. In very simple terms, our ability to aim was imprecise and it caused immense collateral damage. And we would drop thousands and thousands of bombs to drop a bridge that in the past decade we can drop with just one precise weapon. We laughed a little bit in preparation today about the Norton bomb sight. It was the first technological movement to try to begin to solve problems that bombers had been solving by pure windage and iron sights before. It had limited effect. Because of the weather and other things, the Norton bomb sight had limited effect. But what it did signify was the beginning of change of trying to adapt aircraft to be more precise, more discerning in their attack and their ability to affect the target. The other thing that has to be known or said about the Norton bomb sight and some of those early attempts to be more precise is they put the bombers and the bomber crews at incredible risk. On the way to the target and on the way home from the target, there were times when you could maneuver a little to avoid the flak and avoid the fighters and things that were out there. You had to stay in the formation and you had to be a part of a formation, but you could maneuver. But with these early aiming devices, when the aircraft got on the final approach to the target, the air crews themselves talked about it being a time for God and country, because they had to be very still. They had to be very wings level. They made very few changes in either altitude or direction. And in some cases, they were literally being flown by the bombardier. And so during that time, they became much more vulnerable to the attacks and all of the things out there. And so it was an incredible piece of work that John talked about, the sacrifices of these bomber crews. The losses were immense. Flak and fighters got most of them. And John talked about the bigger picture of people. Let me talk a little bit about the Mighty Eighth in number of missions. So in 8th Air Force's campaign alone during the bomber offensive, 10,631 missions. Of that, 4,135 were lost, as you heard John say, 26,000 plus men. It's more than 1 in 3. In the general bomber fight across the Air Force, the Air Corps' initiative in World War II, it was generally said when they briefed, you could look left and right, and that was 3 people, and one of the 3 of you was not coming home, or your crew was not coming home. But in the Mighty Eighth, during that period, it was more than a third of the crews that didn't come home. In fact, the airmen dominated the German POW camps, and it was primarily airmen in them at the time. This sacrifice was not for naught. In the end, the impact was substantial. It slowed the German war machine. It slowed them to a lesser degree in the field, but it slowed them to a greater degree in the industrial rear. And in fact, it had some effect on the German will. And of note, a big part of the increased survivability towards the end of the bomber campaign was another technological breakthrough, and that was the introductions of longer range fighter escort in the way of aircraft like the P-38, in the way of flying with new drop tanks and things to extend shorter range aircraft. But as the fighters began to escort, it helped in the losses to the German defenses. Didn't help in the losses to the flak. So the bomber business took a big change. We'll talk, as Cy has said, later about the Pacific. But we need to note today that the strikes at Hiroshima and Nagasaki changed the trajectory of the bomber force. And as the Air Corps becomes the Air Force, becomes to fully separate and address its own missions, of course, we see the rise of SAC, Strategic Air Command, the birth of the nuclear age, and ultimately adoption of the strategy of mutually assured destruction. And then we see the Air Force making an even bigger swing towards the dominance or the predominance of the bomber force. And we see what fighter guys and other guys call SAC DNA, Strategic Air Command DNA, and the thinking of great leaders like Curtis LeMay, who were pushing the Air Force to this focus on what we later came to call the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan for Nuclear Weapons. And so the mentality or the approach of the Air Force began to move heavily into that area. We'll talk in a few minutes about the later parts of our Air Force. It's important to note that the bomber has gone through a lot of transition in its life. And later, and we'll talk a bit more about it, it became an incredible force in Afghanistan in the close air support mission. Think about that. The B-1 bomber in a close air support mission, and I'll explain that in a few minutes. Every tactical air control party loved for a bomber, a B-1, to show up on station, because unlike the fighters that would come and go, the B-1 would show up on station and be there for a long time, carrying as many as 61 2,000-pound independently targetable precise weapons, and that made it a very cash business. John mentioned airlift, and I would like to say that I think that airlift is what I call the never properly acknowledged age, because airlift has been important to our Air Force and to our ethos for the entire length of our period as an Air Force. In World War II, airlift and airdrop had a very spotty performance record. You don't even have to read very much. If you watched Band of Brothers, which is a pretty good show, you start to see the challenges that airdrop had and airlift had. Primarily struggling with weather, delivery methods, and accuracy. And I love the scenes and the historical correctness of the problems of resupply at Bastogne, and how so much of the resupply was dropped in enemy territory as opposed to in friendly territory to that group of men that were completely surrounded in that Battle of the Bulge around Bastogne. The other one that is pretty easy to understand is the problems we had with drop zone performance in Normandy. And that is the fact that while we went across the water in a very well pre-planned way, as the airdrop aircraft started encountering the flak, as they encountered some weather, as they got into limited visibility problems over the beach and going inside the beach zone, an awful lot of our paratroopers were dropped in the wrong place. And again, the visuals of the story, the stories that are told of men being dropped all over the target area, joining into new formations to try to get the job done, and sometimes as long as a week to find their own fighting unit, points out the issues that we had with airdrop in Normandy. But World War II does end, and then we begin that period just post-war and we had the first, greatest, and probably the most memorable examples of what airlift can do. Operation Vittles. In June 48, the Russians wanted Berlin all for themselves, and they closed all the highways, railroads, canals from Western occupied Germany into Western occupied Berlin. They thought it would make it impossible for the people who lived there to get food or supplies, and eventually drive the other three powers, Britain, France, and the U.S., out of the city for good. But the U.S. Army Air Corps and Air Corps, and eventually Air Force, said not so fast, and they began the Berlin airlift. It lasted for more than a year. Most of you know the story, but let's just hit a few high points. More than 2.3 million tons of cargo into West Berlin. And it's not just about the airmen. It's also about the organization of the airmen and the logisticians on the ground in Berlin. And the way they developed, much like these great things that Cy told you about on the beach, the way that they set the airfields for receiving airplanes and offloading cargo was amazing. Again, a plane landing every 30 seconds. Over 300,000 flights made in all. It was, I think, the greatest birthing accomplishment of our airlift corps. In my humble opinion, airlift is still the least well-acknowledged member of the team. You saw, some of you are old enough, and if not, maybe you've read about the immense logistical operation that went into the preparation for Desert Storm 1. The immense amount of cargo that was some moved, a lot moved by sea, but a lot moved by air in order to stage a war's worth of supply into Kuwait and southern Iraq. And then finally, even more recently, think of this, Afghanistan, a completely landlocked nation, and airlift supplied all the requirements for that war until we could establish throughput on trains and other things that began to help in the resupply. So once again, we can talk about the not forgotten, but maybe not recognized capability of airlift, even at the end of the war, with some pretty non-sophisticated lift running such a huge operation. Let's talk a little bit about the early age of the fighter, as John mentioned. The most recognized role of the early fighter force was about defense. Part of that is because of the extremely limited range and the need to be tied to an airfield. And so most of that fighter force was thought about in terms of defending something. Now, there were some aberrations to that, and we'll talk a little bit about close air support in places like North Africa and other places where we were beginning to try to use the fighter to support the Army. But the most recognized role is the defensive, and probably the key point to illuminate that is the battle for Britain. In June of 1940, Hitler gave orders for the preparation of a seaborne invasion of Britain. He called it Operation Sea Lion. And to make it easier, he sent the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. He knew that he needed to have some air superiority over the battlefield to do what he was trying to do. The Battle of Britain, or Battle for Britain, however you want to say it, was the Royal Air Force's primarily to carry and to hold the ground. About 1,547 Allied aircraft were lost during the Battle of Britain. And of course, the Operation Sea Lion never came to fruition. We began at that time to understand how important local air superiority or very limited air superiority over the troops was. And we had to struggle with the technology of range limited and loiter limited, meaning limited duration over the target kind of aircraft, and had to address those. The role least recognized in fighters, I think, was support to ground troops. And to the degree that they were used in reconnaissance, we don't talk very much about it. To the degree that they were used in close air support, it's not something that we think about as much in World War II. One set of words that every airman understands is in those early years of determining how to use fighters in this role, we had to fight the concept we call penny packeting. not being critical of my Army brothers and sisters, but they need to own something if they think they're going to get work from it or support from it. So if my battalion doesn't own a fighter, I can't count on fighters. The only ones I can count on are those that are in my chain of command. And so in some of the theaters, most notably North Africa and others, we penny packeted. We divided fighters out, and they were used as a rather quick mobile artillery as opposed to how they might come to fruition and support the Air Forces. This was worked through after some failure in multiple campaigns. And eventually there was a recognition for the need to bring air power together and uses its range, flexibility, and striking power in order to have effect on the ground. And it became about brutal prioritization of this very limited asset at that time. So next, I would say in the early Cold War, fighters were all about bomber aviation and intercepting it. Technology and the development of the airplanes, I'm not sure if John's going to cover them or not, but the 102, the 104, the 106, these extremely high-flying, fast interceptor aircraft were all designed in the thought of that SAC-dominated Air Force where we have to defend against Russian bombers. These aircraft were not particularly well suited for supporting the troops. And there was not much change to that set of thought all the way through to Korea. But I want to bring up one thing. Korea is not in our time zone today, but I want to bring up the fact that in Korea, we learned that a force on the ground could be devastated if there was no air cover. And we began to focus on keeping local air superiority or air superiority over our fielded troops. One of the Air Force's greatest bragging points is that from the spring, late spring, I think it was May of 1953 to date, no U.S. soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine has died to fixed-wing attack because we have guaranteed air superiority over our fielded troops. And we're worried now that that would not be the case if we were to have to go to war today because we've lost some focus on that. So I'm going to close. Hopefully we found John and we can bring him up. I want to close with just a snippet of what's to come out there and what we may talk about in the future. First of all, China is changing our Air Force today. The thought of how to fight at extreme range against a capable opponent is telling us that we need to look at that range. Is the range in the aircraft or is the range in the weapon? We need to rethink and focus even more on stealth. And we need to think about capacity. The venerable B-52 will be over 100 years old before we stop flying it. How can we load that thing down with penetrating, long-range, precise weapons and continue to use it in a way? The second thing I think is a challenge is we will fight from space. I know there's a treaty out there. There's been lots of treaties. We will fight from space. Space is not about watching orbital mechanics and monitoring things flying around. We are already competing and fighting in space. Dazzling, blinding, jamming. It's going to happen. I believe there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Star Wars. And then finally, the new discussion of the day is our all-domain action. We've been talking for so many years about land, air, sea, and space, and now we're talking a little bit about cyber. It's even bigger than that. It's information, it's diplomatic power, it's economic power. And how do we bring all domain operations together to focus our will on an enemy? I think that's in our future. And I want to just capture something that John said in my closing. Today, your United States Air Force is the smallest and the oldest it has ever been. It's certainly smaller than when it was born because it was huge, as John described. But as it necked down into 47 when it was officially called the Air Force and moved out, We are smaller and older, meaning our aircraft average age is higher than it's ever been. We are the smallest and the oldest Air Force we've ever been. I'm proud of the job our airmen do, but we have that to face. Cy, do we have John? I'm getting off the stage.
Let's hope so. It is really Chris should know, but I saw John coming back on. Let's hope. John?
Hey, he still has not come on. He was on briefly. I think it might be a network issue with him. So if you want to go ahead and finish your slides while we continue to.
We'll do a little dancing around here in the hope that we can retrieve John. Let me have my slides back and go to the last two, which I didn't cover because I wanted to make sure that I got John in on time. But some of our viewers will perhaps find this interesting. Okay, there is the ENIAC being programmed. Okay, our first electronic digital computer. And you see these women who are actually most of the programmers for the ENIAC, and in fact, did a lot of the programming on the computing that associated with cryptography. This wasn't cryptography. But in any case, each of these ladies have a piece of paper which is a coding of the program. And this is not a stored program digital computer. It was the way it was programmed is that these ladies went around with this list of switches to turn. You see them actually these are little toggle switches that they're turning there. And what they're doing is essentially programming the machine in its central processor by essentially changing the zeros and the ones in the program by hand. Okay, last slide. I think we got John back. One more. That's what the EDSAC looks like. Okay, compare that, and actually that's only part of the EDSAC. And the ENIAC was much bigger, and these computers were able to operate for fairly extended periods of time until their tubes burned out, or at least went bad. They had to keep thousands of tubes alive simultaneously for a fairly significant amount of time. But this is what these things look like, and they had a speed of just a few thousand instructions per second. Okay, John, can we get him back now? Are we? Chris, I thought I saw John come back on again.
Yes, I thought he came on as well. John, can you try speaking?
Should we go ahead and start some of the questions, and then if we can bring him in, jump right into him?
Yeah, I don't think we have much choice.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to try and see if I can get him in via phone. But we'll also try and read some questions to you as we continue on. So,
are you going to be tied up with John? Shall I read the questions?
Yes, you please go ahead and read the questions. Let me get John fixed up.
Okay.
Woody, bring yourself up so we can use you as well.
Okay. Yes, indeed. To our viewers. Okay, let me start with the first question. John Garver addresses this one to me. It's a two-parter. Why was the German nuclear program so paltry? And the second part, a three-parter. And why was the U.S. jet technology effort so paltry? And what type of computer controlled the big 16-inch guns on the Missouri-class battleships? Let me provide as short an answer as I can to each of these. I'll actually turn the jet technology question over to Woody. this is very complicated, actually, the German nuclear program, because the Germans had an idea of what it took to produce a sustained chain reaction of fissionable material about the same time as we did. And in fact, a German refugee, Lisa Meitner, and a Hungarian refugee, both Jewish refugees, Leo Szilard, were really the first to put together the entire concept of what it took to produce a nuclear weapon. And the Germans had two problems with the idea of building a nuclear program. One was that the physics associated with this were condemned as Jewish physics by the German physics community. Two Nobel Prize winners, Stark and Leonard, were basically Nazis who controlled the German physics community. And one really first-class theoretical physicist, Werner Heisenberg, actually went back to Germany. A number of people tried to keep him here in 1939, and he was visiting. And he was really the only guy capable of putting together a nuclear bomb program, and he was put in charge of it. But there was very little enthusiasm for it, partly because of the Jewish physics problem, and partly because the Germans were really terribly badly organized for a project like this. And Hitler felt, and the people around him felt, that the war would be over before they could possibly put together a working nuclear weapon, which everybody appreciated would be a massive project. And so for those reasons, they didn't get very far. The actual detailed story is very, very interesting. This is not the place to go through it. But ultimately, the Germans who worked on it were put in a castle in England after the war, and the British listened in on their conversations. And it turns out they didn't get very far at all. There's talk about what happened to the heavy water in Norway and what have you. But the Germans really were not close. There's some questions whether Heisenberg on purpose didn't try to do it, because Heisenberg was basically a good guy. And they were amazed that we managed to pull it off. But there's a much longer story there that, John, if you'd like, you and I can get together if we ever are allowed houses again to talk about. With regard to the jet technology, I'll turn that over to Woody in just a second. How are you're really talking about over-the-horizon naval gunfire. And this is actually something that's more appropriate for Asia-Pacific consideration. Most of the naval gunfire in the Atlantic theater was line-of-sight firing or close to it. But in any case, from about 1920 onward, there were these analog computer fire control systems. And what you might picture, you've seen these in the movies, and they're actually the symbol for the ratings for naval personnel. These analog fire control systems, they look like a long tube horizontal on top of a tripod. And at the ends of these tubes, there are basically, it's like having two eyes. And that, coupled with the increasing use of radar and rather sophisticated analog computers behind these fire control systems, that would take into account the fact that ships are bouncing around in all kinds of different ways, and that the target you're going to try to hit is very small and over the horizon. They managed to put together some remarkably effective analog computers that would send the targeting information down to the turrets of the large ships, and they were pretty good. They got fairly close, and if you get close with a whole lot of shots, you might actually hit something. But most ships of any size that were sunk in World War II were not sunk by direct naval gunfire. They're sunk by aircraft and torpedoes and that sort of thing. Woody, do you want to take on why the U.S. jet technology effort was so paltry?
Sure, I can do that, and hopefully Dr. Merle will come up to kind of back me up on this, because where I'd like to start answering that question really starts in the First World War. And if you've ever read his book called The Great War in the Air, you begin to realize that from the American perspective, one of the things that we didn't necessarily do well initially was develop airplanes. And there was a lot of money in the First World War that was put into production and very little return on that investment. But one of the keys from his analysis that you can pull out of his book is this idea of engine technology. And it wasn't necessarily identified as such, but when we entered the war, France was making the best engines, and when we started to marry those up with different airframes, we really began to create some pretty nice airplanes. But again, from just the U.S. perspective, we're kind of lagging the fight. I think the next piece of this comes from the interwar period as we lead up to the Second World War. The emphasis in regards to United States air power wasn't necessarily in production of airplanes that were fast. It was in production of airplanes that were capable of strategic bombing. That was one of the lessons that we walked out of the First World War with. So it just was not an emphasis piece to this. It wasn't as though we weren't dabbling in the technology, but it was not something that received a lot of attention. So, and I think the word paltry in this case, we use that only because of what the Germans were able to do. And specifically, when we talk about this, we have to talk about the Me-260. And when you look at the development of that airplane, it's a fascinating study. But when you juxtapose that, for instance, with the development of the P-51 Mustang, there's some very compare and contrast issues that come out of that. So the Germans created a fantastic airplane in the 262, but failed to, and this came directly from Hitler. When Hitler found out that Galland and some of his fellow pilots were using it as a fighter, he apparently went apoplectic, because he originally wanted the jet-driven airplane to be a bomber, and basically took over control and drove the 262 that way, and that really limited what they were able to do with it. The flip side of that, from innovation technology, and I'll circle back around to finish up the question here in a second, was in the Mustang, you had what was probably one of the key pieces of technological innovation of the war, and that was marrying the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to the P-51 airframe. The airframe itself was designed and built in the first case in about 70 days. It was a true marvel of technological development, but the Allison engine, an American engine, did not give it the performance that it was capable of. But when you marry that to the Merlin, it became the defining fighter of the European theater, certainly toward the close of the war. So we had, to that point, a fighter that was fairly dominant. And again, is to circle all the way back around to your question, it really becomes an issue of emphasis. There was not a lot of emphasis given to the need to produce a jet engine, because the airplanes initially that we faced, up until we faced the 262, for the most part, even against the 109, was technically and technologically superior to what it was facing. Had the 262 come on, and again, giving the Allied penchant for technological development rapidly, I would like to think, and eventually we do get there, we would rapidly have caught up in the jet engine technology piece. We would have adapted. There's, technologically speaking, there's always the development, counter-development piece to this. So I hope that answers the question. And again, hopefully Dr. Morrow, if he's on, can expand on what I just said.
Would he grade my paper? I might also add that there were a few conscious decisions made about concern about slowing down production of the existing capabilities, which you described were very good. And if we shifted energy or the industry to trying to do this other, we might slow down the production of what we really needed on the ground. So while it wasn't the predominant force in these discussions, there were some concerns that we should keep riding the horse we were on and turning them out at rate rather than taking a chance of slowing down rate when we needed airframes.
Let me add to that. Both of you have been talking largely about jet technology during the war. The U.S. and Great Britain and the Soviet Union, after the war, all started around the same place. The British and the Americans in the lead. The British actually, I think, fielded operational jet aircraft in a way that neither we nor the Soviets did after the war. But we were all really sort of pretty much the same for those first few years. And it's not like in the U.S. in particular that, or the Soviet Union for that matter, that jets and rockets were not considered at all. The Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech was established actually before the war. We had Goddard, we had people looking at rocket technology here for some time. The Germans just came out ahead for some of the reasons that Woody was talking about. But after the war, it was more of an even race between the three of us. And by the time 1950 comes along, if John will say anything about this, the jet fighter race was okay. We were doing better. Well, John can address this better than any of the rest of us. John, do you want to pick up on this question and also try to loop back into the presentation that was so brutally interrupted by technical difficulty?
Okay, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that I won't be brutally interrupted again, but let's see how it goes. About the B-30. Anybody finish the B-36? Okay, B-36, and it can carry, still okay, 40 tons of bombs, 10,000 miles. But the odd thing about it is that with it has 6 pusher piston engines, and piston engines are not very efficient. They're much less efficient than tractor engines. The tractor pulls a plane, but they use pusher engines because of the problems of having 6 tractor engines pushing over the wing airflow. It was simply too disruptive. So they made them pushers. And then they added 4 jet engines in 2 separate pods at the ends of the wings. Now, this is the only plane, let's say, this thing could fly 10,000 miles. And nobody does that anymore because of aerial refueling. But this could actually reach that far. And I was just going to end it because this is purely a transitional plane. It is really obsolescent when it first appears. But I ran across this interesting slogan. The aircraft slogan, the official aircraft slogan was that in terms of the engines, it had 6 turning in reference to the piston 4 burning, reference to the jet engines. The air crews, which often had difficulties with the plane in flight and with the engines, actually modified that to 2 turning with the pistons, 2 burning because they often caught fire, 2 smoking, which would be the jets, 2 choking, they would be having problems with the other 2, and 2 unaccounted for. So the plane wasn't that reliable. When you get down to it, you realize it's the air crews. And these are 15 men in pressurized cabins. This thing is actually, in terms of technology, it's really impressive. As I said, it'll be good for research and development. But it's not what we're looking for. And we would move to the B-47 and then the B-52 later. Now, did you folks talk about the F-80? Because that's our first transitional jet. And I just think it's worth it to note that the initial British jets and American jets. Some of them are twin engine. The F-80, the P-80 is a single engine Lockheed plane. To note that everybody's, and that goes for the Russians and for us, the jet fighter manufacturers were all fighter manufacturers during the Second World War. In other words, what they did was, with the Americans, when you think of the Lockheed P-80, Lockheed had done the P-38 twin-engine long-range fighter. So it was a logical move, and we're going to see this later with the Navy and Grumman. And then, of course, the F-86 Sabre, the North American F-86, which really became our fighter in Korea. That's the successor plane, if you want to put it this, 51 Mustang, because North American had built a P-51 Mustang, and now it moved to the F-86. But it's interesting to note that neither we nor the Russians in our initial development of jet planes had the aerodynamic knowledge that the Germans had, because they had moved on to swept wing aircraft. And basically what their aerodynamics was showing was that a swept wing of about 35 degrees as opposed to a straight wing, but a swept wing with a narrower board, in other words, a thinner wing, was going to be much more efficient. We didn't have that for the P-80. The British didn't have it for the Gloucester Meteor, those other jets, and the Russians didn't have it for some of their early Lavochkin fighters, and even the early MiGs. So they're all pretty much straight wing. But this is one reason why, when you get down to the P-80's performance, one of the more fascinating aspects of it for me is that the P-80, when it was first flown, had a top speed of 504 miles an hour. And if anyone follows the piston engine aircraft of World War II, a P-47 Thunderbolt had actually flown 502 miles an hour, specially modified. It wasn't the standard production one. But the last P-51 lightweight fighters were capable of 470 miles an hour, which was about the same speed as the last German piston engine fighters like the TA-152. So what you realize is that the P-80, not that great a leap forward from that last generation of piston engine fighters. And it will see service in Korea. Actually, people will come to know and love it probably more as the T33 Jet Trainer. And I have to laugh because my first acquaintance with the plane was when I was, I think, 9 or 10, and we lived in Atlanta. My father took me up to Lockheed because they had an air show, and I knew all the planes at that time, and I see this T-33 sitting there, and it's got a ramp up to it, a roll-up ramp, and I ran up, and my father's trying to catch me. He said, it's a T-33, Dad, it's a T-33. So I ran up, and the pilot was really neat. He's standing there, and he says, would you like to get in? I said, are you kidding? So I he put his helmet on my head. But it was an amazing experience. So I knew that plane. I got a chance to talk to the pilot, but it was just quite fascinating. But this is a plane that's also interim, because as you can see, what's going to happen is by 1950, the F-86 Sabre, and I think the fascinating thing about the F-86 and the MiG is that they're almost precisely the same time. They're absolutely comparable. 1947, first flights within 2 months of each other. 1949 deployed. But they really are the top fighters of the day. And we see that in Korea in terms of the matchup, especially when you match the Soviet fighter pilots who were led by the Soviet ace Ivan Kotzedov against the Americans. That's a tough combat. And so the MiGs, and I presume General Breedlove, who has flown an F-16 against later MiGs, the MiG-29, will have some comments about that because it's an interesting comparison that actually continues throughout the existence of the different planes. Lavochkin, which was another Russian fighter manufacturer in World War II, actually built a plane that looks almost like the MiG-15, but they chose not to produce it because it was too complex, and they stayed with MiG. In terms of bombers, I don't know if anybody's talked about that, but this is a real case, sort of fascinating. You see with the fighters, we need the German aerodynamics. Everybody's trading technology. The British are giving the Russians engines and so on and so forth. Well, with bomber training, what the Russians did with the Tupolev Tu-4 was to reverse engineer the plane from a B-29 because they really didn't have anything like a four-engine plane. Their planes have been twin-engine. Their early four-engine propeller planes just didn't work very well after the 30s. And so it just so happened that there were about 3 or 4 B-29s that had crash landed in Russian territory, and we asked for them back. And of course, the Soviet Union said, well, we're sorry. And what they did was they took the planes, dismantled them, re-engineered them according to the metric system, and in some cases, for example, with the actual defensive weaponry on the planes, they put in a 23 millimeter cannon, which exceeded what we would have, either a 20 millimeter cannon or a 50 caliber machine gun by quite a bit. But this was where, in a sense, if the Soviets didn't have it, we were actually gave it to them in terms of the B-29. But it's additional this trading of knowledge because we were so interested in getting MiG-15s that we actually put out, shall we say, a bounty, and any pilot who flew a MiG-15 and dropped it in our hands, we would pay $100,000 to. And it's worth it to note that there were 4 Polish pilots who immediately took us up on the deal and flew them over from Eastern Europe. So this is a time of sort of technological transfer going among the air forces. That'll do. You folks have probably covered everything, probably even that before, so I'll listen.
So, Chris, are you going to run the Q&A now?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you want me or if Cy wants to continue.
No, why don't you take it over so I can be available to help? I think with regard to time considerations, the 2 questions at the top or near the top from Daryl and Mark seem to go most directly to what Woody and Phil and John are in a position to address. And they're general enough to be useful answers, I think, for all of our listeners.
Indeed. Okay, so I'll read his first one. So this is from Daryl Zay, and he asks, were expenditures for military R&D and deployment/sustainment for standing forces similar between the USSR and the US-UK in the early Cold War? How great were misperceptions during this period?
I'll start, and then I'll let Woody correct and finish. So we knew that we were in a couple of races. One, the race that of the nuclear age, to try to be ready for Russia that was rapidly going to challenge us there. And so I think that we were putting some pretty good emphasis on nuclear business. And there's another question down in there about the advent of the sea launch ballistic missile that maybe we could tie into this answer. And we came to the conclusion that the triad, which still stands today, was the way to go forward. So I think the question was asking what was sort of the disruption in thought when that missile came out. And what we saw at the time was the beauty of having the triad that gives us the flexibility and the survivability of the triad that we still engender today. I'll let Woody clean up behind that.
I think part of the question that I'd like to address initially is the misperception piece. And the short answer to that question is, yeah, I think there was a gross misperception on the part of the West vis-a-vis the capabilities of the Soviet Union. That misperception led to fear, and that fear led to a very robust research and development and production capability in the West. The Soviet Union, because of its proclivity for secrecy, to quote Churchill, the Iron Curtain of secrecy, it was difficult. It was easy in the minds of the Western decision makers to build the Soviet Union into this 1,000-pound gorilla. So a lot of our research and development and a lot of the way that we pursued this had everything to do with the fact that we thought that we were constantly behind the Soviet Union. And what's fascinating is after the war, when you really dig into the archives, there was a great disparity, but generally speaking, we were more advanced in the way that we developed and what we developed than the Soviet Union was. But again, that fear and that misperception drove that.
Woody used the term 1,000-pound gorilla. Another one that was used an awful lot was that they're 10 feet tall. And when we saw the fall of the wall in the early 90s and we began to mix with their troops and see what they actually had, then there was this sort of explosion of jokes like, well, they were really 5'10" or whatever. The bottom line is Woody really characterized this correct. We really were afraid of where they might be, and it drove us hard to be better.
Excellent. So this next question comes from Mark, and it's directed towards you, General Breedlove. And he asks, at the end of World War II and prior to the beginning of the Cold War, was there any pause in the development of aviation technology? Also, can you describe the comparative development of aviation technology among the various victorious powers after the war? Did they continue apace?
So I'm going to kick this to John. Nobody in this group can answer this question better than John Morrow. John?
Okay. In terms of technology and aviation technology after the war, what we have to realize is, in a very interesting fashion, the French basically had sort of disappeared from the whole scene because of the war. It'll take them a while to get back in. So in the early years, the French are basically using American aviation and aircraft from C-119 transport planes to drop paratroopers into Dien Bien Phu. I actually ended up in 1954 with my father on a French aircraft carrier returning from Indochina after the loss of the war. It was a USS Belleau Wood, which was an American escort carrier from World War II, and it was loaded with Grumman F-8F Bearcats and TBM on Avengers, post-war and World War II fighters and bombers entirely. So we got them off the ground. Later on, obviously, what we call Mirage, the Dassault Mirage, would come back and begin to produce aircraft. But it really is that if you watch And I think Woody's characterization of our sense of the Soviet Union, we were quite surprised by the MiG when we saw it, because in terms of its altitude performance, it's faster, it has a higher altitude. In fact, it gained the advantage over the Sabre. What its pilots were supposed to do was fight in the vertical. In other words, go up, go down. Don't get in a turning fight with a Sabre at lower altitude because you're not going to make it. But it also has these incredibly powerful cannon on it. It's got two 23 millimeter cannon and one 37 millimeter cannon. They packed a much heavier weight of firepower than we did. Although pilots often who were pursued by MiGs found that because their radar, we had a much better radar gun sight. Often with these aircraft, it's not so much the aircraft performance, but the skill of the pilots and some of the technology, because our gun sights were better, but the cannon didn't necessarily function coherently because they had a pack they put in under the plane right in the nose, and the 23 millimeter shells would go over the target, and the 37 millimeter shells would go under the target. So a pilot might find himself in the middle and not being hit by either. But the technology on the MiG is actually quite superb, but it's primitive. The cockpits are tight. They're not, the Sabre is simply a better designed aircraft. And for the pilots who flew it, I think that makes a tremendous amount of difference when you've got equal skill levels. But, the British, in an interesting way, the Gloucester Meteor, the British will continue to develop jet airplanes, but to be perfectly candid, and I sort of hate to say this, we have jet fighters, Swedish Saabs, quite good, all right, nowadays. There are other countries that develop, but in terms of the British, their post-war fighters are often not just piston engine, they're turboprop, and they move to turboprops airplanes much more than we do. The Sea Fury, these are Hawker, that's a Hawker plane extended from Hurricane, but much more modernized, more like the Hawker Typhoon and the early Hawker Hunter jets. But when you're matching us up in terms of these planes, we really are the better fighter manufacturers. Now, the British do a couple of bombers. If you've ever watched James Bond, you'll see. I got Phil here. Great. Bail me, Phil. Go on.
No, never bailed. You answered that $1 million. I just wanted to bring something from our conversation the other day about the MiGs that carries through to today, and that is John was talking about how this MiG was designed to be able to fight in the vertical because it had this great thrust, and that great thrust also came at great price. The duration and the time on station of a MiG for history has been far lower than that of a commensurate Western fighter because our jet technology may not have created as much thrust as some of these huge engines that the Russians were using, but they were bigger, heavier, and using gas at a huge rate. And so sometimes we called them lawn darts because you threw them up over the field and then they came straight back down. And we found later on in life that the MiG-29 needed to be carrying tanks to go anywhere to do anything. And if it didn't have the tanks, it was going to be limited to overhead its field. So there's trade-offs there. And certainly if you've got enough gas, you'd love to have that big motor humping you around the sky and providing G available for turn. But if you've got to go somewhere and fight somebody, it's not going to be very helpful. Sorry for interrupting, John.
No, that's great. That's exactly. I was hoping you would raise that. I didn't know if you'd already spoken about it, but that's you see that continues, and it's from the very beginning, and it continues in that same line of development in our planes. Often, it used to be the comment that often the engine was the heart of the airplane, and certainly in some cases it is. It's certainly crucial, but yeah, there's certain trade-offs in the old days, especially World War I and World War II. And Woody did a marvelous job of talking about the P-51 with an Allison engine, which was good only for low-level combat and dive bombing. And then you put a British Merlin, a Rolls-Royce in it, and Rolls-Royce has always made beautiful engines, often very sophisticated and difficult to repair. But you put a Merlin in there, and then with Packard subcontracting and producing the Merlins, you have the best fighter of the war. And it's got long range, it's beautifully done aerodynamically, and it can carry the tanks. But it's just a beautiful aircraft. And often they used to comment, if it really looks good, it is. We have some American fighters that are really just that. Certainly the Mustang. Maybe the Jug doesn't look like that, but the Jug was a beast in terms of the P-47 Thunderbolt. You don't want to tangle with those.
All right, great. So this next one is also from Daryl Zay, and it's for anybody to take up. And he asks, could you discuss the consequences of the development and deployment of SLBMs in the late 50s, early 60s? Was there significant infighting in the Pentagon regarding prioritization compared to SAC for nuclear deterrence investments?
Well, I'll jump on that and then give it to others to answer by just recalling what we talked about a few minutes ago. Our doctrine, our strategy, pretty rapidly embraced the idea of a trilogy of ICBMs, sea-launch ballistic missiles, and the bomber. And so, and frankly, that has survived to today. Every time there's a budget cut looming out there in the military, someone calls for taking down one leg of the triad. And what we see is that creates a vulnerability. It may put our second strike at risk. It may put this, that, or the other at risk. And so there were times in the beginning when there was a lot of competition for dollars. But my read of the literature is that we moved pretty quickly to understanding the value of the triad. John, Woody, or Cy, you guys want to correct my English?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I think, sir, I think that I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And the thing that I would add is this is one of the interesting impacts of technology on military doctrine. With the development of the SLBM, you have a shift to a triad, which wasn't necessarily conceived beforehand, but once the capability and that innovation becomes available, there's actually an adjustment that's made to the doctrine to the point where, as General Breedlove rightly points out, it persists to today. But a lot of this had to do initially with the SLBM development, had to do with the Navy trying to stay relevant in a nuclear world. So that competition helps that as well. But it's an interesting cycle to study, this development and innovation of technology, the impact of that on how we, as the United States anyway, look at technology, how we invest in technology, how we consume technology, and couple that with our doctrine.
Let me, since ballistic missiles were brought up, and we really didn't cover two important technologies that were actually fairly seriously deployed, but not at all decisively before the end of the war. And that's essentially the cruise missiles, the kinds of missiles that were during the war most characterized by the V-1, and the ballistic missile, the true ballistic missile, characterized by the V-2. and they were deployed by the thousands. They were very inaccurate. They had a certain, if you like, a publicity effect. That's understates it a bit. They were sent at Rotterdam. They were sent at London. Most of them sort of went in the general direction of their targets. They were launched, I think, fairly reliably towards the end of the war. And they did a certain amount of damage, but the V1 in particular carried a very small warhead. The V2 warhead payload was really quite small as well. I mean, one British Lancaster bomber could carry, enough explosive power for about a dozen V1s and V2s. But technologically, they were really quite a breakthrough. And all of the post-war principles, well, certainly including the U.S. and the Soviet Union, pursued both of those technologies, especially the U.S. with regard to cruise missiles, with a good deal of vigor. And we shouldn't forget them. The German legacy, both the Soviets and the U.S. Took whatever V2s they could find and played with them. We took more of the people behind them than the Soviets did. But the Soviets really didn't need those people. The Soviets were really very, very capable with regard to rocketry.
Yeah, I agree with Cy on that, because if you go back to the 20s and 30s, both the Germans and the Soviets were very much into rocketry and rocketry clubs. And I think when you look at of course, the V1s, well, both the weapons, Hitler termed them were vengeance weapons or terror weapons. And so accuracy was not that crucial. But I think the most fascinating aspect of the V1s is that if you were an American, a British fighter pilot flying a Hawker Typhoon or one of these really fast, low-level planes, their technique was to pull up alongside the V1. It was just that was not fast enough. You could actually stay with a V1 in a piston engine fighter, and what they would do is put the wingtip under the small wing of the V1 and tip it over. Basically tip it over and down. So it's very interesting and you think, cruise missiles developed from that, but those first ones were like, because there's some of the pilots who did those kinds of things, you think, oh, that's kind of risky. Nah, no big deal. We could catch it, we could get underneath it and tip it over. That was the end of it. They couldn't do that with a V2.
Well, they had some troubles doing that at night. And there was nothing.
I would think so.
On the other hand, they could be shot down, and they did not come over in such great numbers, although a fair number of them actually got through. But it almost didn't matter if you shot them down or not. I mean, if you shot them down and they took ground and exploded, they're just as likely to not hit anything consequential than if they were left alone to run out of fuel and fall.
All right, great. Well, this is the next question that's actually in the event chat, and it's from Joel Cowan. And they ask for more of a general discussion on manned versus unmanned aircraft during this time period.
Billy, what are you?
Well, I didn't see that it was about this time period. I saw that question, and I thought they were just asking for a discussion about drones versus manned aircraft. I don't know the history of what we would call unmanned aircraft post World War II. We could talk about that now if you want.
Go ahead, General, if you'd like to do that.
So the one thing that was interesting about that question to me, and I please don't want the question asker to be offended by what I'm about to say, but I think the word drone is a very imprecise word because drone has this connotation of this thing that goes out all by itself and it does its own thing and it ends up somewhere or it comes home. Where I like to use a little bit more precise words, remotely piloted aircraft and then unmanned aircraft. Because today we really don't have any quote unquote drones. Pilots are driving these aircraft or programming the driving of these aircraft or launching them and then monitoring them. And so in almost all cases, there is pilot in the loop for all points of the mission profile. So I always jump on this question when it's asked because I like to remind that maybe a more precise term is remotely piloted aircraft. Now, we will come to a time where we train unmanned aircraft to go and hunt. And frankly, we're not far from a time where we know we can launch one of these remotely piloted or unmanned aircraft with sensors that far exceed the human ability to sense. When you take infrared, radar, and visual cues and put those together in hunting for a target on the ground, you're going to do a far better job in that aircraft than a set of eyeballs. And so we are getting to the point where we're going to be able to do things. In fact, DARPA just ran a test where they test an unmanned fighter against a manned fighter. And we're going to get to the point where those are going to be more capable and I believe be a part of our future arsenal. But right now, we're really talking about remotely piloted aircraft and unmanned aircraft. And now I'll let it go to some of the really smart people. But I just like to get precise when we talk about these things.
There were some experimental efforts during the war with remotely controlled aircraft that the Germans used a couple with some effect. Actually, they sank at least one ship off of Italy. We experimented a bit too. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was actually killed during an experimental effort to load a B-17 with a huge amount of explosives and remotely drive it into some sort of target. But there wasn't much, I think, that can be said about that. The German effort potentially could have been significant had it gotten to the point where it was deployed on a large scale, but it never came close to that.
Another aspect to maybe deal with, to piggyback on what General Breedlove was talking about with regards to remotely piloted airplanes, one of the things that I think we have learned over time, and my neck tells me every day, is that we are at the limits of human capability in terms of what these airplanes, what these aircraft are capable of. In the F-16, I was a limiting factor in that airplane. The airframe itself was capable performance-wise of much, much more than my body could take. So as we continue to push in terms of capability, in terms of performance, there comes a time when just the physicality of what these airplanes are capable of becomes a limiting factor, and you're forced to go beyond a human in a cockpit.
Woody says he mentioned his neck because this is one of the problems in high G aircraft, which high G also means high rate of turn. And to his exact point, one of the first limiting factors is the ability to keep blood to your brain because of the G's. One of the second limiting factors is the physiology of your neck to be able to stand the G pressures that the airplane can put on it when you're trying to fly and fight, looking over your shoulders, etc., under high G. And he's exactly right. And let me tell you, the older you get in the airplane, the less capable you are of doing those things. For some of us that flew them well into our elder years, it was a problem.
Amen, sir.
Well, Si, I can leave it up to you since you're the session moderator. But since we're at the witching hour, I think maybe this should be the last question. Do you agree? Or would you like to keep going?
One more. Let's give it one more. And
All right. Well, this one's a fun one then for all of you that I think each one of you can answer. Daryl Zay asks, do you have a favorite exhibit at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio?